Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Aishalo and Itihas. For those of you who have hopped onto the channel for the first time, I am Ruchika Sharma. I teach history for a living and I have a few more credentials that have been listed in the description box. Before I go ahead and introduce today's topic to you, I would like to remind you that the link to the previous episodes of Aishalo and Itihas have also been mentioned in the description box. Along with these links, there is a list of sources on today's topic that have also been written in the description box that you can go ahead and check out for a bit of an extra reading or to fact check everything that I blabber over here. Now that all that is passé, I would like to introduce you to the topic of today's episode. Today's episode, please note, is the second in a two-part series on Ashok. The first part has been linked over here as well as in the description box. In case you haven't seen it and would like to see it before you see this, please click on this link or on the link in the description box. Now, the first part on this two-part series on Ashok was largely dealing with Ashok and his portraiture in the Buddhist tradition. The second part, which is this episode, is largely going to deal with Ashok's own edicts as well as the 20th century nationalist historiography on Ashok. Now, the idea of this two-part series is to know less about Ashok but more about the sources and how they are used to separate fact from fiction. Now, this second part, dedicated to Ashokan edicts and 20th century national historiography on Ashok, is going to explore how his edicts, which frankly are a rare source considering they are the emperor's own voice, how good are they a source? How does Ashok, knowing fully well that his voice is going to reach to a lot of people, that his edicts will be read by many people far and wide, as well as future generations, how does he cause his edicts to be written? In contrast to the Buddhist tradition, Ashokan edicts are considered to be far more historical, a source of his time. What does this exactly mean? Are Ashokan edicts absolutely unimpeachable as a source where whatever is written in them is just facts? If not, how do we go about looking at them, especially in tandem with the Buddhist tradition? And of course, these Ashokan edicts were discovered in the 19th century, which is interesting considering India was at that point of time under the colonial rule. What impact did Ashok's memory and the revelation of his history have on a nation which was still reeling under the throes of colonialism? We will explore all of this while doing an azure blue halo eye. Now, a halo eye, guys, is pretty simple. You basically have to have slightly darker eyelids here in the corners and a burst of light, which is basically some glitter, which is to be put in the middle. I'm clearly not doing the best job and making this understandable, so I'm just going to show you. Also, before I go ahead and start working on my eyelids, I would like to inform you that some of you had actually asked me to put at least one line of eyeshadow tutorial with respect to every step that I do in order to get this eye look. And I will be doing that today. Shall I begin? Now, Ashoka's history was woken up from a long and deep slumber by the deciphering of the early medieval Brahmi script by surveyors, colonial surveyors, such as Wilkins, Stevenson's, Troyer, Mill, and Prinsep. Now, Prinsep, or James Prinsep, was the most important for our cause, since he was the one who worked backwards and ended up deciphering Mauryan Brahmi, a form of Brahmi that was prevalent in 3rd century BCE. Now, even though this discovery in 1837 meant that most of Ashokan edicts were now legible, considering a lot of them were written in Brahmi, Princeps still couldn't figure out who the person Devanam Piya Piyadasi in these edicts was. Of course, the much dismissed Buddhist sources came to rescue. When George Turner, an employee of the civil servants in Ceylon, the British civil servants in Ceylon, identified that Devanam Piya Piyadasi was a reference to Ashoka in the Deepavamsa, which, if you remember, was a Ceylonese chronicle that we discussed about in the previous episode. Now, Devanam Piya Piyadasi is basically the Prakrit of Devanam Priya Priyadarshi, where Devanam Piya or Devanam Priya meant the beloved of the gods, while Piyadasi or Priyadarshi meant one who looks at others affectionately. I don't know why I did that. One who looks at others affectionately. Now, these are the two terms that Ashoka usually uses in his edicts to refer to himself. Now, this discovery opened the proverbial floodgates. So much information on pillar and rocks, a most unique way for an emperor to tell his tale. But was this Ashok's own invention? Now, Ashok got the idea of inscribing messages on rocks and pillars from the Achaemenid Empire, where the Shahanshah Dariush, or in English, Darius, would put his inscriptions on rocks, and just like the Ashokan edicts, why are the pattas so difficult? And just like the Ashokan edicts, Dariush's inscriptions start in the third person and then carry on in the first person. Now, the Achaemenid Empire was a contemporary of the modern empire, based out of Iran, but also occupying parts of Europe, North Africa, particularly Egypt, as well as modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. Like Ashok, Dariush's inscriptions were also multilingual, written in 3 languages: Old Farsi, Elamite, and Babylonian. The subject matter of most of Dariush's inscriptions deals with his divine mandate to rule, given to him by the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda. These inscriptions also extol Dariush's many virtues and detail his valiant feats of war. In fact, Upender Singh informs us that the word Dada used in Dariush's Aramaic inscriptions is also the word used instead of Dhamma in Ashok's Aramaic inscriptions. Even the words Dipi and Lipi occur in the inscriptions of both the rulers. Not only the writing, but the art of the edict itself bears a great resemblance to the Achaemenid art. The glossy finish of the pillars, the inverted lotus bell of the Rampurva bull capital have all travelled via trade from the Achaemenid Empire. Even the heraldic lion, so famous in the Sarnath capital, is also stylistically similar to the Achaemenid lion. Susan Huntington is of the opinion that just like the ideas of kingship in the Achaemenid world influenced the Mauryan kingship ideals, the lion, a symbol of Achaemenid royalty, also marked itself in the Ashokan edicts. But unlike Dariush's famous Behistun inscription, where the Shahanshah talks about his illustrious lineage and the many battles that he has gloriously fought, with the relief on the inscription showing Dariush standing on top of his adversary, Kaumata, Ashokan edicts carry an entirely different message. In his Rupnath edict, written in his 13th regnal year, Devanampiya speaks that 2 years have passed since I am openly a Shakya. Now, Shakya over here is a Buddhist reference, or a reference to the fact that he was now a Buddhist. Why Shakya? Because Siddhartha was born in the Shakya clan and was called Shakyamuni. So, Devnampiya speaks that 2 years have passed since I'm openly a Shakya and did not make much progress. But that changed, tells Ashoka, especially after he visited the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic order. The emperor further credits himself with having brought the men and the gods together in Jambudvipa, which he credits to his own progress, a progress that he made after he visited the Buddhist Sangha. But the emperor gives us hope. Just can't with dupattas. The emperor gives us hope by further writing that great heaven can be had by both the high and the low people if they have as much zeal as the emperor does. He also gives instructions on disseminating this message on rocks and or pillars. He tells us that he was on tour 256 nights when he ordered this inscription to be written. Ashoka here is clearly the monarch whose moral piety is so exemplary, it is to be emulated. Henceforth, this piety will be disseminated, as he says, on rocks and pillars alike. But what's more fascinating is that the edict gives us a very slow-paced and gradual vibe to Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism. Now, this is clearly unlike the Buddhist sources, where, if you remember, Ashoka's conversion is overnight, from 0 to 100 in no time. Ashoka, in his own inscription, puts his conversion a lot more humbly, admitting to having no proper zeal after the first 2 years of his conversion. Ashoka continues to highlight his evolution as a Buddhist even in his Girnar rock edict, in which, after proclaiming that no living being is to be killed, Ashoka takes us inside his kitchen, where he informs us that earlier thousands of animals and birds were killed for consumption. But at the time when the Dhamma Lipi is being written, only 3 animals, that is, 2 peacocks and 1 deer, are killed every day. And even these would not be killed in the future. Now, Dhamma Lipi over here is a reference to the inscriptions that Ashoka had put for the sake or propagation of Dhamma, which we'll talk a bit more about later on. Evidently then, this was for Ashoka a slow transformation of giving up habits and ideas that were no longer congruent with his new religion. Now, as a king who had embraced Buddhism, Ashoka in his edicts came to acquire the image of the protector of the Sangha. In his Bhabra inscription, Ashoka lists the various sermons that the monks and nuns of the Sangha must certainly meditate upon. In another edict known as the Schism Edict, Ashoka warns that if a monk or a nun tries to create dissensions in the Sangha, that monk or nun will be expelled. And in order to ensure that this directive is strictly followed, Ashoka also orders that a copy of this inscription is to be put in all the chaityas, or the meeting halls of the Sangha. Now, Ashoka's belief in Buddhism, fused with his role as a statesman, would have made this commandeering role for his religion quite obvious. No matter how much he extols the Sangha and patronizes Buddhism, Ashoka in all his edicts continues to be a statesman. Now, for example, in his Rumanday pillar inscription, Ashoka talks about how he went to Lumbini, where Shakyamuni, the Buddha, was born. Apart from having a stone enclosure and a stone pillar built, he declared the place to be tax-free, reducing the grain contribution of the place to 1/8. Ashoka, the eternal statesman, would never declare Lumbini to be exempt from all its dues. Smart boy. But what about that dramatic episode, the Kalinga conquest? The famous Rock Edict 13, written in Ashoka's 8th regnal year, records Ashoka's extreme remorse and guilt at having caused wanton bloodshed in his quest to conquer Kalinga. Ashoka talks about the magnitude of the loss of lives, enumerating how 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. What pained Ashoka more was the death and the suffering of the Brahmins and the Shramanas. Perhaps the most important line in the edict is Ashoka highlighting that even in his remorse, he has power, and that the forest tribes of Kalinga must repent, lest they all be killed. Interesting that Ashoka here does not vow not to kill, nor does he mention that his remorse at the Kori battle has anything to do with Buddhism. His response seems quite innate to a conscientious emperor who wonders if all this bloodshed is necessary, while also warning that his reluctance to kill will not always protect the dissenters. As a statesman, Ashoka is also cognizant of the high social groups such as the Brahmins and regrets their killing the most. Unlike the earlier Rock Edict, where Ashoka declares himself to be a Shakya and nullifies hierarchy when striving for religious zeal, the repenting post-Kalinga Ashoka upholds caste norms. How does one make sense of this? Romila Thapar argues that the Kalinga War Edict was written in Ashoka's 8th regnal year, which is 5 years before the Rupnath Edict, which was written in the 13th regnal year, which is basically the edict where Ashoka mentions that he's been a Buddhist for 2.5 years. So, Ashoka converted a good 2.5 years post the Kalinga War. Kalinga, therefore, should be understood as yet another stepping stone in the life of a ruler who was inching closer to the widespread religious movement of Buddhism. That made the social ideals of abstaining from killing quite popular. Kalinga can't be presumed to be a watershed event in the life of Ashoka, which immediately led him to convert. Why? Because there's no evidence to it. That's why. In fact, nothing in Ashoka's inscriptions suggests an immediate affinity to Buddhism, leave alone an overnight conversion. Ashoka is measured about his conversion, a lot more humane and natural than the Buddhist texts. The warning to Kalinga about using force despite the remorse is also opposite to Ashoka's post-conversion edicts, where he actively vows to eliminate all forms of violence. However, even in his Kalinga edict, Ashoka talks of a preference to Dhamma Vijaya. Ashoka says that after Kalinga was annexed, he very earnestly practiced, desired and taught Dhamma. He considers conquest by Dhamma to be the true conquest and boasts that he has achieved such a victory over all his frontiers. Now, Ashoka may not have extolled his great lineage in any of his edicts, but in his Kalinga edict, Ashok is mindful of his progeny, where he wants his sons and grandsons to continue following Dhamma Vijaya through patience and light punishments. Interestingly then, Dhamma as a concept in Ashok's life predated his conversion to Buddhism. In fact, the bulk of his edicts are related to extolling Dhamma and spreading its message. But what is Dhamma for Ashok? In his 11th Girnar edict, Ashok asserts that there is no gift comparable to the gift of Dhamma and defines it as good behavior to slaves and servants, obedience to mother and father, generosity towards friends, relatives, Brahmins, Shramanas, and abstention from killing living beings. Which isn't easy, you guys. You can't always be nice to your relatives, right? The emperor emphasizes that following Dhamma would not only help one in this world, but also in the next world. Echoing the trope of a Punarjanam, the cycle of birth and rebirth, which would have been a common belief in his time, considering most major religion during Ashok's reign believed in this concept of birth and rebirth, and also emphasized a liberation from such a cycle. In order to have this message adequately circulated and imbibed, in his 14th regnal year, Ashok appointed a group of officers known as the Dhamma Mahamatmas. In the 5th major rock edict at Kalsi, Ashok is proud that he introduced Mahamattas for Dhamma or officers for Dhamma as they did not exist before. These officers, he claims, are everywhere in his kingdom, establishing Dhamma and increasing the happiness and welfare of others. Clearly then, Ashok wanted his policy to just not be words, but also implemented properly through these specialized officers. The Dhamma as a policy, therefore, seems to be a moral code of conduct, unique to Ashok, but also incorporating several important Buddhist tenets such as abstention from killing living beings. For Ashok, therefore, Dhamma was an ideal way of life, which required one to incorporate few simple daily practices. But important intellectual question: why did Ashok feel the need to promulgate the Dhamma? What's in it for him? Now, if you remember, as the Buddhist tradition points out, Ashok's succession was not very smooth. He was not the first choice to be Bindusar's successor. Evidently then, Ashok, while hustling for succession and eventually coming to the throne, did not receive the support of the orthodox elements in his court. Accordingly then, he moved closer to the unorthodox elements such as the Buddhists or the Ajivikas. Now, if you remember, these Barabar caves, also known as the Lomas Rishi caves, the ones with their floors polished, made out of a single gigantic rock. Ashok spent a lot of money on this. That one was donated to the Ajivikas in Ashok's 13th regnal year. Now, the inscription on this cave clearly states the intent of Ashok to continue to patronize other sects even when sects such as Ajivikas were in direct competition with Buddhism for patronage. And as I said, Ashok donated this cave in his 13th regnal year, which is around 3 years after he became Buddhist. The idea that sects were to be patronized equally is mentioned in Ashok's 12th Girnar Rock Edict, which is just under his 11th Girnar Rock Edict, which, if you remember, was the Rock Edict that spoke about Ashok and his definition of Dhamma. The contents of the 12th Girnar Rock Edict must therefore be logically concluded to be the larger definition of Ashok's idea of Dhamma. Now, the emperor says that Devanampiya Piyadasi honors all sects with gifts and various forms of recognition. Ashok further asserts that gifts and recognitions are not as important as the advancement of the essential doctrine of all sects, and that in order to achieve this, one must control one's speech, especially to not speak ill of another sect, so that people may hear one another's principles and obey them. This, as the edict states, would bring glory to Dhamma. Indubitably, all of us today can actually take a leaf out of this particular edict, which talks about tolerance for all religions. Nainjot Lahiri calls this proto-secularism, which forms the root of Dhamma, with every sect honoring all sects. Now, this makes apparent another reason as to why Dhamma was adopted as a policy by Ashok. Dhamma was an important tool for centralizing and bringing together a vast empire with divergent topographies and immense cultural differences, from Gandhar all the way to Patliputra. Dhamma was therefore an instrument of consolidation for all these territories. Romila Thapar relates this to Charlemagne, a Christian emperor who, after conquering the Saxons, used Christianity as a solidifying force, where the Saxons were all converted to Christianity. Via the message of Dhamma, Ashok comes across as this paternal sort of a father figure, which is something that he very clearly also mentions in his Dholi edict. Ashok plainly states that all men are my children, and just as I desire for my children that they should obtain welfare and happiness both in this world and the next, the same do I desire for all men. All right, Daddy. Sorry, I just couldn't resist the urge. Now, this is why, cognizant of all his children, Ashok didn't put up the Kalinga War edict in Kaling, but Girnar. Primarily because lecturing people who had just lost their lives in battle wasn't a very sensitive move. But also because Ashok as ruler does not want to come across as remorseful in front of a people he has just captured. What a complex man, ruler and believer, Ashok. Now, before we move further, important to interject how accessible to the general public were these edicts, especially the ones who were placed on pillars where the writing was often above eye level. Upinder Singh informs us that Piyadasi wasn't directly communicating with his subjects. The audience, first and foremost, were the high officials, such as the Dhamma Mahamatas. The subjects were the second intended audience, who would get this information from these high officials, usually orally. And the third were the future audience, such as Ashok's own progeny, who would continue to read his inscriptions on stones and pillars. But of course, Brahmi was completely forgotten until Prinsep deciphered it. The discovery of a powerful and highly articulate king invigorated the subcontinent that was reeling under the throes of colonialism. 20th century historians wrote a great deal about Ashoka, while colonial historians such as Winston Smith leaned on the idea of the Orient, where Ashoka was an autocrat, albeit one that Smith really approved of, considering he ruled the church and the state alike. Others, such as B.M. Barua, were of the opinion that Ashoka was to Buddhism what St. Paul was to Christianity. No. Either way, Ashoka breathed new life into the nationalist movement. For leaders such as Gandhi, Ashoka was not so much a historical figure, but an upholder of ahimsa and tolerance, traits which for Gandhi were an indelible part of the subcontinent's history. The first Prime Minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was even more enamored with Ashoka's cosmopolitanism and his idea of giving up war, which he frankly didn't, but we'll let that pass. Of course, there were leaders who didn't approve of Ashoka, like Savarkar, who thought that the policy of non-violence was weak and negative. Ashoka and his memory were nonetheless immortalized as a defining marker for independent India when his Sarnath lions were chosen to be the national emblem. Interestingly, this was the India post-partition violence. Wonder what Ashoka would make of that. Stripping a historical figure from its historical context and superimposing it onto the present is a historical nightmare. An ahistorical nightmare. Ashoka's thoughts may continue to resonate with generations to come. But in his history, Ashoka first and foremost comes across as a statesman, one who seems to have carved an image for himself in pillars and rocks, where he can be seen fulfilling many roles: that of a Buddhist lay follower, the protector of the Sangha, a father to his subject, and a ruler who governed his kingdom by the rules and regulations that he deemed fit. Ashoka was all of these and wanted to be known as all of these. Hence, he immortalized his voice in stone for posterity. And that is all that I have for you today. Please note that if any of this resonated or made sense, there is a list of sources in the description box that you can use to do some extra reading on Ashoka. And before you just walk away, please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, please hop into the comments to let me know what you thought about this video, as well as what you'd like to see in the next video. Bye-bye.